All right. Thank you, Chris. And thanks for inviting me to be part of the webinar series. And thanks to all of you for coming today. Like Chris said, my name is Jeff Matthews. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Sciences at the University of Illinois. And my talk today is about wetland restoration and ecology, and I'll try to keep it as non-technical as possible. To start with an overview of what I'll be talking about in the webinar today. I'll start with key characteristics of wetlands and a bit about how to distinguish different types of wetlands, particularly focusing on types of wetlands that we have here in Illinois. I'll discuss briefly the benefits that are provided by wetlands, talk a bit about wetland loss and biological impairment of wetlands historically, and then discuss protection and restoration of wetlands. And I really want to talk about some of the challenges that wetland restoration practitioners face when they're trying to restore these habitats. So what is a wetland? There are different definitions of wetlands for different purposes, whether those purposes are scientific definitions or legal definitions, but most modern definitions of wetlands really stand on three key pillars. And those are water, soils, and organisms. Wetlands are wetlands, hence the term wetland. And wetland hydrology refers to the flow of water into, through, and out of a wetland site. So descriptions of hydrology will incorporate information on the duration of flooding, the depth, the seasonality and timing of flooding, as well as the various water sources that can provide water to a wetland. Wetlands are areas where water is present at the surface, or at least within the rooting zone of plants for at least some portion of the growing season. And wetlands aren't necessarily always wet. Many wetland types, in fact, are really only temporarily wet after major flood events, for example, or maybe seasonally wet during the late winter and early spring, but maybe dry out by the end of the summer. Soils in wetlands are another key characteristic. And we refer to hydric soils as soils that form under flooded conditions. Soils in wetlands are very different from soils in even closely adjacent uplands. And this is largely due to the fact that soils develop very differently under flooded conditions, because when soils are flooded, they're very quickly depleted of oxygen. And that changes microbiological processes in the soil, as well as chemical processes that are driven primarily by microbes. And that changes wetland soils in a very profound way that's actually visible in the soil. One way is that in some types of wetlands that are, particularly wetlands that are more continuously flooded, there tends to be a buildup of organic matter in the soil, accumulation of muck or peat, due to slow decomposition of plant material under those flooded conditions where there's very little oxygen to support decomposing organisms. In addition, under those flooded conditions, the microbiological and chemical processes change in ways that alter the mineral colors of soil. Iron chemistry in particular is very different under flooded soils. And you can see in the soil core here in the middle photo, the dull gray background of the soil spotted by kind of orange concentrations of iron. So iron concentrations are different, and that leads to visible differences in soils that can be identified in the field. The organisms that live in wetlands also have to be very specially adapted to those wet conditions. And in many cases, because wetlands are sometimes alternately wet and then dry, those organisms also have to be adapted to extremes of both wetness and dryness. And so wetlands are identified in the field based on these three characteristics: hydrology, soils, and organisms, in particular wetland plants. And hydrology is really the master variable. It can be thought of as the driving factor that really determines type of wetland, the type of vegetation in the wetland, the chemical, biological, and physical processes that occur in that wetland, and as well the ecological functions and benefits that it provides. Most people think of wetlands as herbaceous dominated communities where maybe a marsh dominated by cattails, for example, or a pond. Many people don't think of wetlands as forested, but many of our wetlands in Illinois actually are dominated by trees or shrubs rooted in hydric soil. So these forested wetlands include riparian forests, floodplain forests, shrub swamps, cypress tupelo swamps in southern Illinois. And then in tropical coastal areas, mangrove swamps are also another type of wooded wetland. Other wetland types are dominated by herbaceous plants or non-woody vegetation, and really hydrology determines the type of vegetation that can occur in a site. Even in drier end herbaceous wetlands like sedge meadows, wet prairies, wet meadows that may be only seasonally or temporarily flooded, there's still often enough water there to exclude terrestrial plants and woody plants from growing. So in the example photo on the left, this is an interdunal swale in Wisconsin. On the dune ridges on the right and left of the photo are trees, and then down in the swale between those dune ridges where trees are kept out by flooding is a stand of native sedges. As flooding duration increases to a longer duration, that sedge meadow or wet meadow vegetation often gives way to marsh vegetation. Marshes, like in the middle photo here, dominated by what we call emergent plant species. These are plant species that are often found growing in shallow water, but the leaves emerge up out of the water. So species like cattails, bulrushes, arrowhead, shown closer to the foreground in this picture, are typical marsh species. In more permanently or deeper flooded conditions, that marsh vegetation then gives way to floating leaved or submerged aquatic vegetation in shallow ponded areas. And often these different wetland types kind of grade into each other along a natural topographic gradient from higher elevation to lower elevation. So we often see in natural wetlands distinct zonation, where there's maybe a wet meadow zone, which at lower elevation transitions to a very different marsh vegetation type, which transitions to maybe a more aquatic vegetation type. So that duration of flooding and depth of flooding really determines what we see in the wetland. A few more unique wetland types that we have in Illinois: seeps, fens, and bogs. Seeps occur where there's groundwater output to the soil surface. This often occurs at the toe of a slope, or maybe on a slope where there may be a steep break in the slope where groundwater then exits to the surface. And that groundwater can keep those soils saturated for sometimes continuously throughout the entire year. So continuously wet soil conditions really change the plant community that can occur in those areas. Fens and bogs are unique and somewhat rare wetland types in Illinois, particularly found in the northeastern part of the state. Fens are peat or muck forming wetlands that are fed by calcareous groundwater. So this is groundwater that's flowing through limestone or dolomite bedrock. As it flows through that calcareous bedrock, it's picking up minerals like calcium, magnesium. So these fen wetlands tend to have a higher pH and tend to be a little bit more nutrient rich than bogs. Bogs, in contrast, are peat forming wetlands that are fed primarily by precipitation. And rain and snow is very, very nutrient poor. And so these bogs tend to be nutrient poor as well. The typical plant species of a bog is sphagnum moss. And that sphagnum moss, as it decays, releases organic acids. And so bogs tend to be very acidic and nutrient poor environments, with a lot of peat formation due to the saturated conditions and the slow decomposition. Both fens and bogs support some very unique and rare plant species, as well as insect species that are dependent on those plants. Historically, wetlands were often viewed negatively. They were seen as impediments to travel as people moved westward across the continent. They were often viewed as non-usable wasteland that needed to be improved, drained, and converted to other more usable land, and even seen as sources of disease and pestilence. And it wasn't really until about the mid-20th century that attitudes in the United States started to change about wetlands as people became aware of all the benefits that wetlands provide to society. Some of those benefits that were first recognized were the value of wetlands in coastal regions for fish and shellfish production. The fishing industry was really dependent on coastal wetlands for fish production. In addition, in the interior of the United States, in the interior plains, marshes were recognized beginning in the mid 20th century as very important sites for waterfowl production. And so it was really wildlife biologists at the state and federal level, as well as duck hunters and duck hunting organizations that really made the first push toward wetland protection in the United States, recognizing the values of those wetlands and the impact that wetland destruction was having on waterfowl populations. A lot of the benefits that wetlands provide come as a result of the position of wetlands within the broader landscape. Wetlands tend to occur in specific places in the landscape. They often occur at the interface between terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. And so they can act in some cases as a buffer between land use that's happening in the uplands and downstream water. They also occur in depressional landscape settings. And so they tend to accumulate water that's flowing across the landscape, as well as any materials that water carries with it, including pollutants and nutrients that's flowing across the landscape. And you can think of wetlands as these landscape sinks. And it's that position of wetlands as landscape sinks that really makes them valuable for collecting, storing, and processing a lot of the materials that flow across the landscape and end up in those wetlands. And some of those benefits include water quality improvement. As water is flowing across the land, picking up pollutants, nutrients, or as rivers overflow their banks during flooding conditions and fill up the floodplain wetlands, that water tends to spread out in a shallow surface across the wetland. It slows down the flow rate of water, decreases the erosive force of that water. And as that water slows, sediments can settle out of suspension and end up on the bottom of that wetland. Attached to those sediments are often organic pollutants or phosphorus. And so wetlands are very important sites for long-term storage of phosphorus, preventing phosphorus from going downstream and ending up polluting downstream waters, causing algal blooms and other problems. In addition, wetlands are very important processing sites for nitrogen as well. Nitrates in particular are a very highly reactive form of nitrogen that's very usable by plants and causes nutrient eutrophication problems, is transformed in wetland soils into nitrogen gas. Under flooded conditions, denitrifying microorganisms in wetland soils take that nitrate, convert it into nitrogen gas, turning what it was once a very reactive form of nitrogen into a very inert form of nitrogen gas, essentially removing nitrate from the biosphere and sending it back up in the form of nitrogen gas to the atmosphere, removing it from land and water. Wetlands are also important for flood control. Wetlands, because they slow down and store water, they tend to release water to downstream areas very slowly. And so where you have a lot of wetlands in a landscape that can store a lot of potential flood water, it tends to decrease flood peak height. And so that can prevent downstream flood damage. In addition, because of the slow decomposition in flooded wetland soils, wetlands are also very important sites for carbon storage. As that organic matter builds up in those wetland soils, that carbon can be stored in the form of peat or muck for a very long period of time, preventing decomposition, which would transform that organic material into carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Wetlands are also very important productive spawning and feeding areas for fish and shellfish. Coastal wetlands in particular are some of the most productive ecosystems in the world in terms of both vegetation production as well as production of animals, including fish and shellfish. And many commercially harvested species are dependent on coastal wetlands for at least some portion of their life. Historically, wetlands, forested wetlands, very important for timber production, particularly in the southeastern US. and important for wildlife habitat, as I mentioned, waterfowl. And wetlands are important for recreational opportunities as well. For example, much of the US National Wildlife Refuge System involves protection and restoration of wetlands for wildlife viewing and other recreational opportunities. Unfortunately, by the time that people began to realize the benefits of wetlands, much of the historic wetland area in the US had been converted to other land uses. This figure, the map here of Illinois in red, shows the distribution of hydric soils across the state of Illinois. And although maybe not exact, it does represent a good estimate of the extent of historic wetland acreage or area and distribution in the state of Illinois prior to extensive wetland drainage. And you'll notice that there are some unique patterns in the map here. You'll notice, for example, that there are a lot of hydric soils and former wetland areas concentrated along the major riverways, particularly the Illinois, the Wabash, and the Mississippi rivers. There are high concentrations of wetlands in certain parts of the state, like in the Green River lowlands, a depressional area in northwestern Illinois, as well as around Kankakee and what was once the very extensive Grand Kankakee Marsh. The black line through the state here represents the greatest extent of the most recent glaciation in the state. This was the area of Illinois that was most recently covered by glaciers. Much of the rest of the state was glaciated in older glacial events. But because these were older, the streams and rivers in those more older glaciated plains have had more time to develop and cut deeper into the landscape. And so drainage is more efficient in the western and southern part of the state than it is in the more recently glaciated east central and northeastern part of the state. And you'll notice that the distribution of wetlands is very even across east central and northeastern Illinois. In these flat plains with very poor drainage, water didn't have anywhere to go, and so it would sit on the surface. Much of this area historically would have been seasonally wet prairie, interspersed with some marshes and sedge meadows as well. In contrast, in the rest of the state, you'll notice that a lot of the wetlands are concentrated along stream and river valleys. In yellow here on this map shows the current distribution of wetlands in the state based on data from the National Wetlands Inventory. And you'll notice in this map in yellow, the wetlands tend to be concentrated in river floodplains and stream valleys. There are also large concentrations of wetlands in groundwater supported areas in the Chicago region, particularly in the north of Chicago in Lake and McHenry counties, where there are a lot of extensive lakes and marshes. And you'll notice few wetlands in bedrock dominated landscapes, particularly the Shawnee Hills in southern Illinois and the very northwestern corner of the state, the driftless area, which was unglaciated, and these bedrock areas tend to have fewer wetlands. But you'll also notice much of the wetland area in east central Illinois has disappeared. And this is primarily due to drainage for agriculture, underground drain tiles and ditches that have drained these former wetland areas for conversion to agricultural systems. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service estimates that 53% of the wetlands historically present in the lower 48 U.S. states have been destroyed. Most of this has been due to conversion for agriculture. In very intensively agricultural regions like Illinois, Iowa, Indiana, the Central Valley of California, wetland loss has been even much more extensive than that. In Illinois, we've lost 85 to 90% of the original wetland acreage. The chart at the bottom shows data from the periodic reports from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service called their Wetland Status and Trends Reports. And these data show for different time periods, acres of wetland change on an annual basis. And so mid 50s to mid 1970s, on an annual basis, we were losing about over 450,000 acres of wetlands per year. And it was really the 1970s when policies regarding wetlands started to change. So in the late 1970s, for example, US Department of Agriculture did away with some incentive programs that had formerly provided monetary and technical assistance to farmers to convert wetlands to agricultural land. 1977, those policies were removed. Also in the late 1970s and early 80s, a permitting system developed under the US Clean Water Act that regulated specific development activities in wetlands and prevented destruction of wetlands without compensation through restoration. And in 1985, the US Farm Bill specifically implemented disincentives for farmers who knowingly converted wetland to farmland. So as a result of these policies, as well as state level policies, and just a growing recognition of the value of wetlands, which spurred conservation and restoration at every level, we've seen a greatly reduced rate at which wetlands are being destroyed in the US. And so this promising trend that we see through time has kept up. Even in the report that covered the period from 1998 to 2004, US Fish and Wildlife Service even reported a net gain in wetland area in the US. To some extent, that's a little bit misleading because a lot of that wetland gain is probably due to the creation of stormwater retention basins in urban areas, which don't necessarily function as high quality wetland habitat, but nevertheless, the trend here is promising. So in addition to the loss of wetlands and conversion to other land uses, much of the remaining wetland area is recognized to be in poor condition and biologically impaired. In 2011, the US Environmental Protection Agency, in coordination with states and tribes, conducted the first national wetland condition assessment. This was repeated in 2016 and then again in 2021. And the goal of this effort was to determine the ecological condition of US wetlands. This was based on a survey of wetlands across the United States and some very extensive field sampling that involved surveying vegetation at the wetland sites, taking water samples, several soil samples, and based on a survey of over 1,000 wetlands in 2011, EPA estimated that about a third of the wetland area in the US is actually in fairly poor condition. And they identified a number of stressors that are impacting US wetlands. Many of those included physical and hydrological disturbances to the site. For example, vegetation removal, such as tree clearing, activities that harden the surface, like deposition of fill material in those wetlands, or soil compaction from industrial activities, and hydrological modifications on site, like ditching, which was draining or partially draining a lot of these wetlands. Some parts of the country, wetlands were also impacted by chemical stressors, such as heavy metal contamination or high soil phosphorus content. And particularly in the interior plains, of which Illinois is a part, non-native plant species were a major problem in much of the wetland acreage surveyed. The first step in protecting wetlands from these kinds of stressors is to identify them and locate wetlands on the ground. And you may be interested in locating wetlands on your own property or maybe nearby parklands. And even if you're not an expert in plant identification and you can't readily identify wetland plant species, or you're not an expert in identifying hydric soil features, you can still fairly readily recognize wetlands based on their position in the landscape and evidence of either current or past flooding at the site. So on the ground, what you're looking for are really areas that look like they've held water in the past. And as a clue to that, you can look for areas that are in depressional landscape settings, maybe areas with sparse vegetation, like in the photo here, compared to the surroundings. Areas maybe where you see watermarks on trees, water-stained leaves, areas of deposition where maybe sticks and other debris have been piled up due to the movement, due to floodwaters. All clues to evidence of past flooding and the likely presence of a wetland at that site. There are also some useful free online tools for identifying wetlands from a desk. One of these is the National Wetlands Inventory, which has a wetlands mapping tool. This is supported by US Fish and Wildlife Service and is useful for identifying large areas of wetlands. In addition, USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service has a web soil survey, which can be used to identify hydric soils. These online mapping tools are very useful for kind of large-scale mapping applications or locating wetlands remotely. But when using these tools, it's important to keep in mind that they sometimes miss small wetlands or kind of unique wetland types. Sometimes wetlands in forested regions are obscured by trees and more difficult to detect. If it's a question of maybe construction or development impacts that might affect wetlands, negatively impact wetlands, it's important to consult an experienced wetland delineator. Wetland delineation is the technique of determining the wetland boundaries in the field, identifying wetlands and mapping out their boundaries. Because wetlands are protected under the US Clean Water Act, regulatory agencies, and at the federal level, that's primarily the US Army Corps of Engineers, will make jurisdictional determinations regarding wetland regulations under the Clean Water Act and whether certain activities require a permit if they might impact wetlands. Once wetlands are identified, the means to protect them from the various wetland stressors involve not only protecting wetlands from on-site activities or on-site damage, but also because wetlands occur in this landscape sink position, they tend to be vulnerable to land uses that happen very far off-site. So all the water that's flowing across the landscape ending up in that wetland has the potential to introduce stressors to the wetland itself. And so protecting wetlands means protecting them from both on-site and off-site stressors. And because hydrology, of course, is the master variable controlling wetland biology and function, it's very important to avoid hydrological modifications that would impact wetlands, either delivering more water to the site or impounding a wetland to keep water on a site for longer, which alters the natural vegetation, or diverting water away from the wetland, which would tend to dry out the wetland and also impact the natural vegetation. Both too much and too little water can be a stress for natural vegetation. It's important to limit input of pesticides and fertilizers in particular, as they run across the landscape and end up in wetlands, tend to stimulate the production and growth of invasive plant species to the detriment of native biodiversity. One way to protect wetlands is to maintain buffer strips of native vegetation around the wetland. Not only does this provide a buffer that prevents inflowing pollutants and nutrients, but it also provides habitat for wildlife species, particularly species that spend part of their life cycle in the aquatic environment and part in the terrestrial environment, like amphibians and reptiles. And of course, it's always important to avoid spreading invasive plants and animals that might negatively impact wetlands as well. Another way wetlands are protected and some of the lost benefits from destroyed wetlands can be restored is through the process of wetland restoration. Wetlands are restored by a variety of different entities and for a variety of different purposes. For example, nonprofit organizations like the Nature Conservancy. The top example here is a photo from US Fish and Wildlife Service of the Emaquan Preserve along the Illinois River. If you're not familiar with this site, it's a very extensive restored wetland area, recognized as a wetland of international importance and particularly important for waterfowl migration. Government agencies also restore wetlands for a variety of different purposes. For example, federal and state agencies might restore wetlands to provide wildlife habitat or recreational opportunities. local government or entities often restore wetlands for stormwater control. This middle example here is from Weaver Park in Urbana, Illinois. This is a site that was constructed to manage stormwater flows to a nearby neighborhood and provide water quality improvement benefits as well, managed by the Urbana Park District. And some wetland restoration is undertaken because it's actually legally mandated. The bottom example here is a photo of the Sugar Camp Creek wetland mitigation bank in southern Illinois. This is a large area of restored forested wetlands and marshes, restored by the Illinois Department of Transportation to compensate for impacts to wetlands that were destroyed during road construction or road improvement projects. And so this restored wetland is intended to offset destruction of wetlands elsewhere. On private land, the USDA, Department of Agriculture, Agricultural Conservation Easement Program provides landowners with assistance for restoring and protecting wetlands. Landowners can enter into permanent or 30-year easements with USDA. And in the case of permanent easements, the USDA NRCS will provide up to 100% of restoration costs for restoring wetlands, including wetlands that are currently farmed, as well as what areas that were formerly wetlands that have been converted to agricultural uses. The restoration process itself is a very stepwise and iterative process that involves first establishing goals and objectives for the restoration. Once those goals are established, it's important to really identify and assess the stressors or impediments to achieving those goals on the site. And because wetland restoration often involves restoration of hydrology and water flows, that often means a very detailed assessment of hydrology is necessary. If appropriate hydrology is not established and the site ends up being either too wet or too dry, wetland restoration won't achieve the goals that it's intended to achieve. And so often one of the first activities in wetland restoration would be to evaluate current and existing wetland hydrology on the site, maybe monitoring hydrology through groundwater monitoring wells for up to a year before initiating restoration activities. That can provide valuable information about current baseline conditions and how the site might need to be altered in order to restore that hydrology. So the next step is to ameliorate those stressors, and with wetland restoration, that often involves redelivery of water to the site. And once that hydrology is restored, the next step is then to accelerate the process of ecological succession. Sometimes wetland restoration relies on plants to naturally colonize the site, but often it involves planting species that wouldn't otherwise naturally recolonize very quickly. And that can jumpstart the process of succession and more rapidly establish desired vegetation communities. And then finally, and ongoing, monitoring and maintenance of the site. It's important to, because wetlands are very dynamic systems and conditions can change from year to year depending on weather and hydrological conditions. It's important to continuously monitor these sites and reevaluate and reassess the goals for the site. And so this arrow going back to establish goals again, this continual process of monitoring, reevaluating goals, implementing new adaptive management approaches and adaptive restoration approaches to achieve those goals is an important and often overlooked step in the restoration process. Restoring wetland hydrology on agricultural land, that often involves removing existing drainage features. So that might mean plugging existing ditches, filling ditches, breaking up underground drain tiles in order to increase the duration of flooding at the site. In wetlands that are restored for wildlife habitat, waterfowl habitat in particular, The approach has often been shallow water or moist soil impoundments to hold water on a site for longer, often with water control structures that can allow the water levels to be raised or lowered depending on the particular needs of migrating waterfowl at that time, or to stimulate the production of plants that produce food that's valuable for migrating waterfowl. Often restoring wetlands also involves some amount of earth moving, can involve shallow excavation to intercept seasonally high water tables, or simply to create more topographic heterogeneity at a site, creating areas of deeper water and shallower water within the same restored wetland can provide some habitat diversity for a wide variety of plants and animals. In some cases, wetlands can be restored along existing edges of ponds or lakes by shallowly grading the banks to create a shelf on which marsh vegetation might be established. Some of the problems with restoring wetlands come from either restoring wetlands that are either too dry to support wetland vegetation or too wet. The figure here shows a restored marsh near Schaumburg, where the banks were really too steeply excavated. And so instead of marsh vegetation, what we have is a very narrow ring of marsh vegetation around an otherwise deep water pond that doesn't support vegetation at all. This is often a challenge in restoring wetlands in urban settings. There's often limited space available. And so there's a temptation to very quickly reach low elevation. And so that can encourage the builders to dig the banks a little bit too steeply, which doesn't provide much area for wetland vegetation to establish. At the same time, these wetlands restored in urban areas often have to double as stormwater retention ponds. And so that has brings in potential problems with pollutant inputs, as well as a very unnatural and flashy hydrology where water levels fluctuate very rapidly. Marsh and wet meadow restorations are often directly planted, often with plugs of emergent plant species like bulrushes or sedges. Sometimes these areas are seeded directly. In some instances, a topsoiling approach can be used. Perhaps there's a wetland nearby that's slated to be filled or destroyed. Topsoil can be harvested from that site and then spread out on a restored wetland that can deliver organic material, intact microbial communities, as well as intact plant seed banks in the soil, which can then very quickly germinate and reestablish a vegetated community. Herbivores are often a problem for newly planted restored marshes. Particularly rabbits, rodents, and geese are a problem. In the figure here, you see the fencing that's surrounding the marsh vegetation that was planted along the shore of this lake here to prevent goose damage. And soils are also an important consideration in marsh and wet meadow restoration. Soils in restored marshes tend to have very low organic matter content and very high bulk density, so that the soils are heavy and dense. And so it's important during the restoration process to really minimize compaction to the extent possible with earth moving equipment. And in some cases, it's been found to be beneficial to directly incorporate organic matter into the soil, for example, by mixing in straw or biochar during the initial restoration phases, which in some cases can improve soil structure and organic matter content. One of the biggest problems with marsh and wet meadow restoration is invasive plant species. In a survey that we did in 24 restored wetlands in Illinois, all of which a goal of the restoration was that these sites be dominated by native vegetation, we found that invasive plant species were a major constraint to achievement of restoration goals. And in fact, 38% of the wetlands that we surveyed were dominated by invasive reed canary grass. 29% were dominated by invasive narrowleaf and hybrid cattail. And this is a problem in wetland restoration, particularly in the Midwest. These two species, as well as species like giant reed and purple loosestrife and a few others, are highly problematic invaders in restored wetlands. Context also matters. The star here on the map marks the location of a restored marsh just south of Decatur, Illinois. And you'll notice that this site is surrounded by a highway interchange, and beyond that by agricultural lands. There are very few natural wetlands in the surroundings that might have provided seed sources for natural colonization of the site by wetland plants. The water source here is agricultural runoff, and then roadside ditch runoff, which carries with it pollutants and road salts. And the end result, a marsh dominated by narrow-leafed cattail, surrounded by invasive yellow sweet clover. So this is just kind of a cautionary tale. The context really matters, and selecting appropriate sites for restoration is important if goals related to establishment of native vegetation are to be achieved. Planting is also a concern for forested wetland restoration as well. It's usually recommended that seedlings be planted, for example, bare root seedlings, which is preferred to direct seeding. Directly seeded sites tend to have slow establishment of trees, and those very small seedlings, if they do germinate, need to compete with sometimes very competitive herbaceous plants that are often very dense. Planting of trees in forested wetlands often focuses on what are called hard mast trees. These are species that produce hard nuts that are valuable for wildlife, like oaks and pecans. Valuable for wildlife, and also these hard mast tree species tend not to recolonize restored wetlands very readily on their own. And so if they're desired at a site, they often have to be intentionally planted. However, they grow slowly, and they're also very susceptible to damage from flooding and deer browse. And pecans in particular are very susceptible to flooding. And so establishing these hard mass species can often be a challenge in restoring forested wetlands. And there's been more recent interest in intentionally introducing other species as well, like light-seeded and faster growing trees like silver maple and cottonwoods. Even though species like silver maple, cottonwoods, willows will actually readily recolonize most restored forests on their own, planting them can give forest restoration a head start, more rapidly establish vertical vegetation structure that's important for species like songbirds, and also very quickly create closed canopy conditions, which can shade the understory and prevent invasion by species like reed canary grass. So some other challenges to vegetation establishment in restored wetlands. The herbaceous understory, herbaceous plants are often ignored during restoration of forests with a focus instead on trees. And so herbaceous understories are often very poorly developed in restored forests. And even species that are very typical of and common in naturally occurring forested wetlands are just missing from restored forests. And so I think there needs to be more attention paid to directly seeding understory herbaceous communities as well as the trees. Like I mentioned previously, these hard mass tree species don't readily recolonize on their own. One trade-off with planting light-seeded species and faster growing species instead is that they do tend to create very dense and shaded conditions, which can then even further prevent the establishment of any hard mass species that are interplanted among them. And so at some point it may be necessary to go in and continually thin out some of these stands of the faster growing species to allow gaps of light where these hard mass species can colonize. Other challenges include drought, flooding, and herbivory, particularly deer and rodents are a problem for reestablishing trees. And flooding is another major hindrance for initially establishing planted trees. This example here is from a restored wetland just north of Springfield, Illinois. It was initially constructed and planted with trees in 1999 and 2000. But then in 2002, there was a major flood. The Sangamon River, the levee along the Sangamon River overtopped, water backed up behind the levee for a very long duration. This was in the late winter. The water froze, ice shear damaged a lot of the trees. Then the water continued to sit on the site throughout the spring, and the anoxic flooded conditions in the soils killed a lot of the other trees. So in the chart here shows as a line the percentage of trees that remained alive on an annual basis in the site. And that's overlaid on the bars, which show the duration of flooding during that particular year. You'll see the very long duration flooding in 2002 corresponded with a loss of about 30% of the planted trees at the site. And the end result of this was not entirely disappointing, because this is what the site looked like in 2015, really kind of patchwork of the scattered trees that remained, interspersed with a lot of patches of native herbaceous vegetation, in particular large areas of native sedges, which may have come in during the floods themselves, as these sedge species are water dispersed species, and appeared at the site shortly after this major flood. So some key points from my webinar today. Wetlands can be identified based on hydrology, soils, and vegetation. And wetlands provide a lot of benefits, what we call ecosystem services to people. But a history of wetland drainage, filling, and other impacts to those wetlands has really impaired those benefits. One way to help counteract historic wetland loss is through restoration of wetlands, despite the various challenges that restoration practitioners often face when attempting to restore these sites. So I'd like to thank you all for attending, and again, thank Chris for inviting me, and thank the U of I Forestry Extension for hosting this webinar series, and I'd be happy to take questions.